Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the York Festival of Ideas 2021 as we celebrate 10 years of educating, entertaining, and inspiring. I'm Pragya Agarwal. I'm a behavioral and data scientist, author, and speaker. And after my PhD at the University of Nottingham, I was an academic in US and UK universities for over 15 years. And now I'm a freelance consultant and founder of the 50% Project, looking at gender and racial inequities around the world. This event, Women's Bodies Gaining Control, is one of two events presented in collaboration with the French Embassy in the UK, exploring important contemporary issues facing the world today. This is a really hugely personal topic for me, but also a topic of professional interest. I've written at length in my first book, Sway, about how women's health and pain gap and the biases in the medical domain that have meant that both race and gender play a role in how women's bodies are treated, their pain and their health diagnosed. We know that Black and brown bodies receive less painkillers and a delay in diagnosis and treatment. There's plenty of research to show that. In my latest book, Motherhood, Otherhood, released 2 weeks ago, I discuss how ideas of womanhood have been shaped through history, how women's bodies have been sexualized and stigmatized. And as the title of the book refers to, I talk about those bodies on the fringes that do not fit the idealized norms, and how our choices are shaped by our status in society, and how it determines who is seen and who is invisible. I write about autonomy and agency, and I show through historical research and scientific investigation that both gender and race play a huge role in how women's health has been managed, focusing in particular on society's obsession with women's fertility and fecundity. Before we begin, a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again. Subtitles are also available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom on your screen. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome the first two speakers today, Elinor Cleghorn and Marie-Hélène Lahaye. Dr. Elinor Cleghorn is a feminist cultural historian. After receiving her PhD in 2012, Elinor spent 3 years as a postdoctoral researcher at the Ruskin School, University of Oxford, working on an interdisciplinary medical humanities project. She now works as a writer and researcher and lives in Sussex. Elinor's book, Unwell Women, was released last week. Marie-Hélène Lahaye is a Belgian feminist lawyer, blogger, and whistleblower who has been campaigning for a more respectful birth. She's the author of the blog Marie Accouche Là, excuse my pronunciation, Marie Gives Birth There, which aims to explore feminist and political issues around birth, highlighting the gap between medical practices in hospitals and scientific recommendations. She's the author of Childbirth, Women Deserve Better, and has helped bring to light in the French-speaking world the issues of mistreatment of women during and around childbirth under the term of obstetric violence. Fabienne Coupe will be translating some of the questions and comments from English to French for Marie-Hélène. Elinor will talk first and then hand over to Marie-Hélène. Elinor, over to you.
Hi, and thank you so much, Pragya, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much to York Festival Ideas for having me to this incredibly important talk today. It's a real honor. Last week, I published my debut book, Unwell Women. The subtitle is A Journey Through Medicine and Myth in a Man-Made World. And in this book, which was inspired by my own personal experience of misdiagnosis, dismissal, and doubt within the medical system, I chart the historic roots of the gender pain gap and the gender health gap that impacts the health and well-being of women and girls today in really life-limiting ways. And what was really important to me, based off my own experience and over these issues becoming so much more discursive and important over the last couple of years, was to really show where this perpetual sense of dismissal, distrust, and undervaluing of the bodies of women and girls has come from in our history. And today we're grappling with some really important questions around how women and girls can gain control of their bodies, gain control of their sexual and reproductive health in particular. And my research has taught me that in order to gain control, we are struggling against some very ingrained and very entrenched forms of knowledge that situate women and girls as instruments in systems of power. From the very beginnings of medicine's history, or of the history of our Western evidence-based medicine in ancient Greece, ideas about the anatomy and biology of women and girls have been used to also enforce and reflect cultural and social stereotypes about how women should live, who they are, how they can think, how they can love, what they can do with their lives. And even as medicine has advanced past, say, a system of beliefs into an evidence-based science, we see how powerful these myths and diminishing stereotypes have been in terms of medicine being able to continue to enforce diminishing ideas about the lives of women and girls. I think that what we're facing today is the legacy of a very long history of diminishing and undervaluing women's bodies. And of course, women's sexual and reproductive health is an incredibly important part of women being able to participate fully in the world on equal terms, being able to reach their full potentials, and also being able to have that degree of autonomy around their bodies and lives that they really need to do in order to fulfill that. Historically, medicine has been a system of power that has withheld autonomy around bodies from the people who own them, the people who live in them. And we're also facing a long history of medicine being a patriarchal system of power, which is always assumed to know more about the bodies and organs and biology of the people it's instructing on than the people who live in them. So I think what we're trying to grapple with today is the legacy of this. And I'm so thankful that we can have discussions like this now, because I feel that issues around gender disparity in healthcare are becoming so much more credible. We're discussing them, we're having conversations that are truly important, but we're also facing up to our history and the complicity of systems of power like medicine in diminishing and oppressing the lives of women and girls across the world. It's, you know, it's only recently that women and girls have been included, for example, in medical research. Since 1993, when the National Institutes of Health in America changed policies to recommend the inclusion of women and also minority subjects in medical research, which really tells us a lot about how recently it's been that the bodies of women and minority people have been valued within the system of power that is medicine. You know, we're always striving, and we need to strive for visibility and credibility, which, you know, isn't what should be happening. We should be valued and credible and seen primarily as the owners and, you know, autonomous agents of our own health and well-being. So in terms of the changes I'd like to see, as well as facing up to our history, which is incredibly important in forcing change and driving change for the future, is that women are respected as the best and most reliable narrators of their own health, and they are trusted to have knowledge and education about how best to manage their lives, because until women are given informed consent, we're given comprehensive knowledge about their sexuality, about their reproductive choice, about their illnesses and their pain, then equality cannot be reached. So I feel that discussions like this are really indicating that we're in a time of change. But we also, of course, as well as cultural change like this, which legitimizes these issues, we also need urgently systemic change that makes governments promise not to obstruct and place barriers in the way of women reaching their full potential in terms of their reproductive choice and their sexual well-being, which is truly important and comes from funding, it comes from government commitments. And yeah, I really hope today that we can expand these discussions, which are just so urgent. And yeah, I'd like to thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, everyone. During a lifetime, each Western woman undergoes an average of 50 gynecological examinations. 50. From their teenage years, young women are sent to medical practices for routine checkups or to obtain contraceptives. Many of them are forced to undergo a full gynecological examination with a vaginal examination, a smear, and breast palpation, when this practice is not recommended before the age of 25. Only doctors are authorized to prescribe contraceptives. If a woman is pregnant and does not want to continue with their pregnancy, she must go to a doctor to perform an abortion. Only doctors are authorized to perform an abortion. When they are pregnant and wish to continue with their pregnancy, they must receive medical attention. A medical delivery in hospital is the norm. Later on, cervical cancer and breast cancer screening exams follow each another. During the menopause, it is normal for women to go to their doctor. The menopause is considered as a disease requiring hormonal treatment, heralding the decrepitude of the female body. The entire sexual and reproductive life of women is subject to medical supervision. During their lifetime, women undergo an average of 50 gynecological examinations when they are generally in perfect health. Nothing of the sort is imposed on men. How do you explain this pathologization of the female body? By two reasons. One, the conception that medicine has of women, and two, patriarchy. What conception does medicine have of the female body? As a sick body. Aristotle was one of the first to have developed a theory according to which the male body is perfect, while the female body is incomplete. The uterus was considered as a dangerous organ which moved around the body, which can stick to other organs, which it makes sick. This conception, which opposes the male body as a healthy body and the female body as a sick body, lasted for several millennia. It crystallized in the 19th century in a very misogynistic society, which was very hostile to women. Women were also considered weak, fragile, devoid of intelligence. It was at these times that modern gynecology and obstetrics were born. At the same period, hysteria, a disease specific to women, was invented, always in reference to this dangerous uterus. The 21st century medicine has still not rethought its relationship to women and their direct heir to this millennia of misogynist conception that the male body is the healthy body and the female body is the sick body. The second reason for the pathologization of female body is patriarchy as such. The goal of patriarchy is the appropriation by men of the productive and reproductive capacity of women. The control of the female body, in particular of her uterus, is a key issue. Since the 17th century, the states have been concerned about the falling birth rates. Having a large population means having economic power and men for war. In implementing a natalist policy, the public authority quickly implements three measures. One, the prohibition of contraception. Two, the prohibition of abortion. And three, the medicalization of childbirth. These three measures have never worked since they had no impact on the birth rate. Despite the prohibition of contraception, couples have found a way to limit birth. The prohibition of abortion has never stopped women from having illegal abortion, including by risking their lives. The medicalization of childbirth has only marginally reduced child and maternal mortality. The main cause of death in childbirth was childbirth fever. Women would give birth on the Monday, everything was going well. Their baby and themselves were in perfect health. They had a high fever on Thursday, and they died of sepsis on the Sunday. There was significant decreased maternal mortality as a result of the discovery of antibiotics in the 20th century. Then, thanks to this discovery, childbirth fever disappeared in the West, and the cesarean section became a safe operation from the beginning of the 1950s to compensate for the 10% of pathological delivery. However, it was in the 1960s, 15 years after the end of childbirth mortality, that the majority of women gave birth in hospital. The obstetrical violence denounced today are the direct consequences of the medicalization of childbirth and the failure to respect the natural process of childbirth. The prohibition of contraception, the prohibition of abortion, and the medicalization of childbirth resulted in the oppression of women. When, from the 60s and 70s, the laws authorized a slightly wider use of contraception and abortion, it was by maintaining an absolute control over the female body by doctors. Contraception and abortion had to go through doctors. Today, the activists who denounced the medicalization of childbirth and obstetrical violence come up against medical power and the states which maintain childbirth in the medical field at all costs. So that women can reclaim their bodies, this is therefore necessary to find two sources of oppression. One, the idea that the female body is sick by nature, and two, the patriarchy, which gives doctor the task of controlling the female body. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, both Elinor and Marie-Hélène. That was wonderful. Could I just remind, if you're watching live, you can add your questions in the Q&A box throughout the event. Now I'm going to introduce and invite the next two speakers, Professor Ellen Annandale and Dr. Martin Winckler. Ellen is Professor of Sociology at the University of York, UK, where she was previously head of department. She is Chair of Trustees of the Foundation for the Sociology of Health and Illness, former editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Social Science and Medicine. Her research has focused on gender inequalities in health and women's reproductive health care. Her publications include Women's Health and Social Change and the Palgrave Handbook of Gender and Health. With colleagues at the University of York and two NHS hospital trusts, she has recently completed a research project funded by the National Institute of Health Research on interactional practices of decision-making during childbirth in maternity units. Martin Winckler is a French fiction and non-fiction writer. He has published 15 novels, including The Case of Dr. Sachs, several critical analyses of the medical establishment and medical training in France, and half a dozen public medical information manuals on contraception, women's health, and patients' rights. His novel, Le Chœur des Femmes, The Women's Choir, was adapted as a graphic novel by feminist artist Aude Marmillot this year. As a practicing GP, he worked in the French countryside for many years, as in the Women's Health Center at Le Mans Hospital. He emigrated to Canada in 2009, where he has developed long-standing involvements with McGill University in Montreal and Ottawa University. It is now my pleasure to welcome Ellen, who will talk first, and will then hand over to Martin.
Okay, so again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to join the panel. So women's bodies gaining control. Okay. I think it's really important to recognize that our bodies are not only biological, they are, they are heavily, fundamentally social and heavily gendered. So social relations of gender within patriarchy foster socioeconomic inequality and harmful gender norms that are hostile to positive health and healthcare for women worldwide. Let's take as an example of this an objectionable yet also rather laughable but true extract from a medical textbook from the 1970s. So this author said to medical students, if, like all human beings, the gynecologist is made in the image of the Almighty, and if he is kind, then his kindness and concern for the patient may provide her with a glimpse of God's image. This links, of course, back to the points that have already been made by Elinor and Marie-Hélène about the operation of patriarchy within healthcare systems worldwide. But actually, the point I want to emphasize alongside this in my talk is that despite such proclamations, and more, of course, women have not been passive, they have not acquiesced, they've fought back. In other words, they've sought to gain control. There are many examples of this, but as mentioned during the opening of Generation Equality in Mexico, a couple of months ago in March, the executive director of UN Women spoke of mobilizing, of raising voices, and of a fierce tide of activism. So as we can see quoted on this slide, she said, we stand on the shoulders of feminists of all ages who want change. We want to end the phenomenon of bystanders. Everyone has to be involved. They're mobilizing in person in the streets, they're mobilizing in millions online, and everywhere they're raising their voices in the effort to achieve equality, justice, and peace. Activism today, of course, activism is not new. There are many examples of this going back in time, and this is just one image from the 1970s, from the women's health movement. And we've seen this witnessed more recently in the women's marches that have taken place worldwide. So we see on this slide placards to the bottom left, my body, my choice, my rights, and you can't silence me. Activism, of course, takes many forms, of course, as seen in the controversial embodied protest, for example, by the group Femen, which began in the Ukraine, but now protests internationally. And these days, we can't overlook the power of social media, so-called hashtag feminism. This has really transformed traditional offline activism, propelling voices for change by enhancing connectivity in global cyberspace. And what I'd like to do in the next 2 or 3 minutes is to highlight this activism, both in person and online, and of course the two are connected to each other, with the example of female genital mutilation. For those unfamiliar with FGM, the World Health Organization's definition is on this slide. So female genital mutilation is a traditional harmful practice that involves the partial or total removal of external female genitalia or other injury to female genital organs for non-medical reasons. And you can see on the right that the kind of 4 types or classification of FGM on the part of WHO. So FGM has significant health implications, such as urinary problems, menstrual problems, complications during childbirth, infections, pain, and long-term psychological trauma. Over 200 million girls and women, estimated of course, are affected by FGM worldwide, mostly but not exclusively in Africa. Examples of powerful voices, both on and offline, are the Girl Generation. This is an Africa-led movement to end FGM. And on the slide here, we witness, I think, their powerful online presence, such as this Facebook page, a screenshot I took some time ago, from the Facebook page of Girl Generation Burkina Faso in West Africa. Amongst other things, Girl Generation speaks out against the medicalization of FGM. That is the move away from cutting women in the community by so-called traditional cutters towards cutting by medical professions in clinics. It's quite a controversial matter and something that has been denounced by the United Nations, WHO, and other organizations. Another example of activism in this area is the group FGM. In FGM is the group 28 Too Many. So what I'd like to argue or suggest to you is that digital grassroots organizations like these are potential game changers, especially for young women. And this is particularly important, for example, in the context of Africa or countries of Africa, given the so-called youth bulge, that 50% of more of the population now are in younger age groups. So this is a real opportunity. And this was recognised at the first Youth Roundtable of the Generation Equality Action Coalition for Technology and Innovation, which took place in January, of course, in collaboration with Generation Equality Forum. So in swift conclusion, then, what I want to suggest is, despite the odds, which I appreciate as substantial and have already been highlighted by our speakers so far, I want to put forward that women are taking strides to gain control of their bodies. They have always done this, going back in history, and through this, they're taking control of their health. So thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event, and particular thanks to the French Embassy for their support.
Well, thank you first for inviting me to this talk, and especially since I'm a man. And in a way, there is a paradox that I should be called to contribute to something that is about women, and especially women's health. I'm a physician. I've been a physician for a long time, and I was a physician for 25 years in a women's health center, where I was an abortion provider and a prescriber of all kind of contraceptive devices, and also a counselor for women who were enduring intrafamilial violence. So, and I was always in a very difficult situation as a man to answer a number of questions. I have come to some conclusions about the role of healthcare providers, especially men, but all healthcare providers, in the patriarchal treatment of women. And I think that, as it was said earlier, especially by Marie-Hélène Lahaye, physicians, medical doctors in many, many countries, especially in France, are very much on the side of patriarchy and on the side of treating women as objects instead of treating them as people and autonomous persons. So I came to the conclusion there was something that should be done about medical training. And I'm talking here about France, but I think that some of the reflections I'm giving here today might be of use for other countries as well. I think that there are three things that could be done as far as training physicians in order for them to take better into account all the problems that we've talked about, especially pain in women, especially just believing what women say when they are suffering from something, but also what they say about their freedom and their right to exert this freedom as far as their body is concerned. I think that I fully support the idea that one's body is something that should be the person's own decisions, and no other person should decide for any other person's body, especially not for women. I'm a full supporter of abortion rights. I'm a full supporter of the right to get sterilized if you want to be sterilized and not have children at all, and of course access of contraceptives. But I think there is a lot to do in the medical world and in the medical institutions in order for those rights to be respected by all healthcare providers. And I think there are three things that we should think about very strongly. One is all healthcare providers should be trained to serve all individuals equally, and especially to support women and people who belong to minorities to make their own choices about their body. And women in that sense are representative of all people who belong to minorities and that are oppressed by the patriarchy, and especially by physicians. And I'm talking about people from LGBTI community, people, handicapped people, people from ethnic minorities. I think that there should be a strong training in all the rights, all the laws that protect individuals, and the fact that healthcare providers should be the advocates of people from minorities, including women, and especially women, in the light of the laws. There are laws in all countries that protect women, that protect minorities, but very often those laws are not applied, or they are not advocated by the people who should be advocating them. Especially, for example, in France, everyone is able to get to be sterilized, to have a vasectomy or to have a tube ligation when they're 18, but many doctors refuse to do it, even though it is allowed by the law. So medical professionals should be trained and should be strongly warranted about the fact that they are advocates for the persons as far as the law is concerned, that they should help and support the rights of people when the law allows them to have the right to abortion, for example, or to get a tubal ligation. The second thing is, I think that medical curriculum is centered on the male body, or at least on a neutral body, while almost 70% of people who go to a doctor are women. And so we, as physicians, are not trained well enough in female physiology. And I'm talking about physiology. I'm not talking about disease. Just understanding what the physiology is and all its variation, and how it should be known to physicians, and how physicians should help people, and especially women, with our physiology without medicalizing it or over medicalizing it, or turning it into a disease, like Marie-Hélène said earlier. This is something that is very important. Physiology, female physiology, is not taught to all healthcare providers, and it should, because if you can take care of women, and if you know their physiology, male physiology, much simpler. And in French, we say qui peut le plus, qui peut le moins. When you can do the most, you can do the least. So I think that medical training should be focused on female physiology and before the medicalizing or turning women into diseased persons. And third, I think that the curriculum in medical education should be built and rebuilt, should be deconstructed and rebuilt by women themselves. We've seen a picture of the book Our Bodies, Ourselves earlier in Annandale's presentation. I think that women are the persons who are most able to instruct healthcare providers about their own bodies, their own physiology, their own ailings. And I think that medical curriculum should be rebuilt, deconstructed first, and rebuilt with women, but also by people from minorities. I think that any kind of training that involves someone who belongs to a minority should be, at best, taught by someone from that minority, or at least very much informed and supervised by someone who belongs to the minority. I think it's not acceptable for a physician who is not someone from the LGBTQI community to instruct about sexual orientation medical students. So these are things that I'm not going to be able to do as a participant in a medical school, because I don't belong to any, but I would like medical schools to think about that. Thank you for listening, and I'll let Pragya take over.
Thank you so much, Ellen and Martin. That was wonderful. I'm going to invite all the speakers back on the stage so that we can have a discussion and take some of the audience questions. I just want to say that so much of all that you said really resonated with me, and the kind of things that I've been writing about and talking about, especially Martin, what you talked about, how, and I think Marie-Hélène talked about that as well. And Ellen mentioned some of that, and Elinor, about how the male body becomes the norm and the male physiology becomes the norm, about how we, and I wrote it in Motherhood, about the language that is so biased, about how we don't learn about the women's physiology. We don't learn about our own bodies as we are growing up. This sense of ignorance is also why we trust doctors or medical professionals so much sometimes, because we're not taught to trust our own instincts or taught about our bodies. But even in the language and medical scientific textbooks that I was looking at, there is the perineum, and then there is the female perineum. So the male body is taken always the norm, and often all the parts of female body are not even shown in these diagrams. And so female sexuality and is stigmatized, and we don't learn about that. And so all those kind of things, and the way language is structured, takes on the gender norms and gender inequalities of society. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what would autonomy really look like. We talked about autonomy, and I wonder for each of you, what would true autonomy and this kind of knowing, this notion of control over our own bodies look like for each of you. So we could start by from Elinor, please.
Hi, thank you so much, Pragya. I think autonomy for me would look like understanding that I was being trusted as the most reliable narrator of my body experiences and of my pain, of my experience in my own body, and the way that that intersects with my social and life experiences as a mother, as a woman, as a chronically ill person. I think that, you know, to be seen as a human, to be met as a human in situations where our health and well-being is on the line, where we're trying to negotiate this for ourselves. It sounds so simple, but it's the most difficult thing to attain, because the power of prejudice in terms of gender stereotype that is really magnified sometimes in our encounters with medicine, in our encounter with medicine and the way that that is structured. Sometimes if what is happening to us isn't immediately understood in terms of objective, clinical, immediate scientific knowledge, I feel like that's when the stereotypes, the assumptions sort of come in and trounce understanding of who we are. So I feel like autonomy and control would come from understanding that we can all go into that medical setting, which can be very difficult and traumatizing for many people, and be met as humans, be actively listened to, and feel that we are contributing through our voices, through our stories and experiences to our care, and that the care that we then receive is informed by our own very particular knowledge about ourselves.
And obviously we can't change all this or address this until we address gender roles and stereotypes that are so deeply entrenched in our society. So there has to be a systemic change around it. And as we saw recently with the WHO report, and also the whole obsession with low birth rate at the moment, that there is a kind of a revisiting of this obsession with women's fertility, and the fact that that there's a gender stereotype that women are the ones who are responsible for carrying on, for their own fertility, for their any failure in their fertility as well, while men are absorbed of these kind of responsibilities as well. Marie-Hélène, I was going to ask you a question about, you mentioned about, so just continuing with this obsession with women's fertility, you talked about how women don't have any autonomy or control during childbirth, and they're not able to make these decisions. And I know that there's a whole lot of status bias and white coat bias that comes into play as well. Why do you think there is this paradox that women's fertility is such an obsession, but women don't have any control during childbirth and maternity?
Yes, thank you. Yes, this is a paradox. So the problem is that there is a lack of information for women. A lot of women doesn't know how their body works, how the childbirth works. So the first condition of autonomy is information, it's knowledge. This is a power. And the second thing is the question of the risk. So there is also a stereotype about the risk. For men, this is normal to have risk, to risk their life, but for women, no. So I think there is also something important to say about women can risk their life. It's just life like men. So if she want to use to choose a way to give birth, okay, she take the risk, and it's so like this. So I think the risk is a very key issue also about childbirth. And also we need the idea. I think all the women do have the idea that they have the same value, the same power, and the same freedom as men. This is, I think, the key for women autonomy.
Thank you. And I think it's really interesting because so much responsibility is placed on the woman itself. So for instance, here, the NHS, the person who Dido Harding, she recently said that women need to stand up more for demanding their rights during medical treatment and diagnosis. And so I feel like women are again made to feel responsible and guilty for not having control on their bodies rather than looking at the systemic imbalances, where I think Martin's point about training physicians more is a really great point, I think, about how we can train them more to understand this kind of gendered notion and bias and the language that creeps in and how they can do that. What do you think, Martin, we can do more to get more men engaged in this discourse as well? Because I know men make a lot of decisions for women, but they are perhaps not as engaged in this discourse about the bias that exists in medical terms.
I think that there are many men who would be willing to advocate as physicians, as healthcare providers. They would be willing to advocate for women if they were allowed to train as physicians and healthcare provider. I think there is a strong filter that prevents a number of men who would be healthcare providers to actually become, for example, physicians, because historically, physicians came from the richer parts of society. And you just don't look at people the same way, whether you come from a rich part of society or you have been raised in a part of society that is more poor. I think that one of, and of course, if you're white, I think access to healthcare professions from people who usually don't get access to that kind of training is very important, because there you will find allies and advocates who will advocate for women like they would advocate for their own minorities. I think there's a problem in how we recruit physicians and healthcare providers. So that's one thing. The other thing is, well, when men who are in power do not respect women, they are not punished. I think there should be a much stronger weight put on people to meet their obligations as physicians, as healthcare providers, to be at the service of people, whoever they are, whatever their gender, whatever their origin, whatever their language, whatever their religion. I think that this should be an obligation. You have an obligation as a healthcare provider to advocate for your patient, whoever that patient is. And I don't think that people are really fully trained in that and fully, shown that it is their obligation. And there should be in medical training a way to tell people who don't want to get into those obligations, well, you're not allowed to do that job. I mean, hopefully we try to train people from the military, people from police, people who are fire fighters, to respect a number of rules, a number of laws. Why don't we do that with physicians more than when it is done? And that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think it also comes down to the systemic imbalances that exist in a society, the power imbalances. So there are more men who are in these decision-making roles, even for women's bodies. They're not women who are making decisions about abortion access or contraceptives, or these rules and regulations are being made by those who will never face the same kind of issues or problems, so they do not understand the bodies that they're making decisions for. And so we have Ellen back. It's great. Ellen, I wanted to ask you about, you gave a more positive spin from the activism side about what's happening. And yes, it's great to see the digital activism, and especially the mobilization of some of these issues and discussions that are happening on social media these days. Why do you think there's still a gap, that things are not changing that much on the ground, do you think? Or do you think they are?
Yeah, I think there are many, many barriers to activism and to change. I just wanted to highlight really that women are not passive to what is happening to them and their bodies, haven't been throughout history. And we have seen significant change, even though there's a significantly long way to go. So the reason why things are not changing on the ground is probably generational, and linked to, I didn't see the beginning of this discussion, but it seemed to be about gender and health professions or in healthcare. So we need to see these generations of women who are, particularly younger women who are involved in activism, and I know it's not exclusively younger women, coming through and having an influence in terms of perhaps becoming health professions, working in health systems, and eventually having influence in positions of power. Because as you were just saying, just talking, I was thinking, and this applies particularly to countries of the global north like the UK, we're seeing the so-called feminization of the medical profession, but we're not seeing women in substantially in positions of power and influence within health systems and influencing kind of decision-making guidelines and policies and so on. So I think it's a matter of generation and time gap, and that hopefully in coming decades, 1 or 2 decades, maybe, you can't really predict, then we hopefully will see more effective change as women can come into positions of influence.
I think I'm going to, there's quite a few audience questions, so I'm going to start taking a few here. There's one from an anonymous attendee saying, which I was thinking about as well, and I suppose it's directed to Marie-Hélène, if you have any thoughts on this. Is there an intrinsic contradiction when we speak about medicalization of, say, childbirth, set against the alleviation of pain during childbirth? And the way in which, for instance, a birth by C-section is almost presented to a woman as a subpar birthing experience. And I discussed this in Motherhood in my book about how C-section is shown as doctors as that you're not a natural mother, that it doesn't release some of the maternal hormones, or that and in the past, we know that mostly male midwives who proposed, like Grantley Dick Reed, who proposed that if you don't face pain during childbirth, then you're not really a true mother, that every woman should be prepared to face pain during childbirth, which also links to how women, when they ask for pain relief during childbirth, are not given often pain relief. So what do you think about how this even within childbirth, there's this bias against C-section, and a lot of women end up feeling guilty that they weren't giving birth naturally, so to speak? Marie-Hélène, Fabienne, did you want to translate it? Or you
I can try in English if I don't find, maybe Fabienne can help me. So first question, why is it so, for me, there is also a stereotype about pain. For men, it's good to have pain. I'm a strong man because I have pain. For women, no, you don't need to have pain because you are weak. So this is also a question about stereotype. Second thing I would like to say is C-section. Are you sure there is no pain with C-section? For instance, we know that about, I don't know, a few % of C-section is done without analgesic. So this is a huge pain for women. So for me, C-section is not necessarily avoiding pain. And third thing is also about stereotype. When you do sports, you have pain also. But for men, it's okay to do sport and to have a very strong pain. For women, not. So it's a good thing also to think about, why do I absolutely give birth without pain? Why? I can have a little bit pain. Okay, I just have a little bit pain, like what I want. So I don't know why there is a so strong obsession about pain and medicalization this pain. I don't know. For me, how can I explain it? It's first that it must be a choice of women. If you don't want to feel anything, it's okay. It's your freedom. If you want to have a C-section, it's okay. It's your freedom. And if you want to give birth naturally, it's okay. It's your freedom. So why women feel always guilty is because women are always guilty about everything. When you are a mother, you feel always guilty about your children, about what's happened because you're a bad mother. So it's okay, do what you want. You are free. You don't need to feel guilty for everything.
Yes, this guilt is something we internalize, don't we, because of societal expectations that we are supposed to act a certain way, and these pressures that are put on us. So yes, I think what you talk about stereotypes about natural birth versus C-section, within even birth, there is this hierarchy of birth about how best you can give birth. I will ask another question from about menopause, which is from Liz Wants-Marie, who says, the panelists have talked about a range of issues. What do members of the panel feel about addressing the taboo and lack of support and treatment during menopause? How can this be changed, and why has nothing moved on from the damaging World Health Institute study in 2002? I'm not familiar with this particular study. Why is there such a lack of research in the area, and would this help in moving understanding and treatment and support forward? Yes, I suppose we've been talking more about menopause, and I think it's linked to how there is so much obsession with the women's fertility that perhaps when they are beyond that, they are not considered of value to society. And I wonder if Elinor, you wanted to add something to this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for the question. I feel like menopause is rightly, as the questioner indicated here, it is still so shrouded in taboo, and so many of these taboos which have been entrenched in medical knowledge especially since the 19th century, when menopause was couched in these narratives of deficiency and lack and deficit, as if the sort of, intrinsic power of being a woman ran out when her, at the end of her, as it were, fertile life. And the language, and you were talking earlier, Pragya, about the power of these entrenched forms of language. And menopause is one of those processes in life that has been deeply affected by forms of language that have been used to describe it, both medically and culturally. And I think because of that, because of this association with uselessness, with these stigmas around that the value of women's bodies being so associated with fertility, that we've got a lot to do to move on from the stigmatizing idea that what's happening to us before, during, and after menopause is not valuable. I'm encouraged. Recently, I've seen more discussions about the many different diverse symptoms of perimenopause, many of which are not properly or fully understood, and that there are women who go through many different symptoms, who are wrongly diagnosed or misdiagnosed with different conditions, when really what we need is more, just again, more information, more awareness, both from our physicians and culturally, about this really important time, and how we can, we're not going into this sort of dark and murky space where we're just not valuable, and what's happening to us isn't important, because it's hugely important. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Elinor. Yes, did Ellen wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this brings us back to the issue of medicalization that we've been talking about in the context of childbirth. And I mentioned in terms of FGM, certainly I agree entirely with what Elinor said about the kind of women being kind of stigma and women kind of suffering in silence. But I think there's quite a tension really, particularly within feminism and within women's voices, about whether this is something that should be recognized as not a medical event, it's a natural event of the body, and why should women be suffering, and perhaps the suffering is socially kind of constructed, by which I don't mean that it's unreal, but it's exacerbated by the social situations that women are in. Or should we, as some people would argue, significantly medicalize the menopause, HRT available to all, and there shouldn't be a resistance against that. Certainly there's been quite a lot of popular discussion of that opinion recently, that really menopause is something that should be medicalized and should be treated biochemically.
Thank you both. Yes, I think there is a lot of ignorance around menopause. I know personally, I went through early menopause in my 30s, and it wasn't something that I wasn't even aware of, that it can happen so young, and nobody really talked to me about it. And whenever I went and spoke to my physician, my doctor, there were other reasons that were found about it. There were blood tests done, and there was never mentioned that this could be one of the causes for it. And against HRT, there was a lot of resistance and reluctance. When I actually spoke to her, she said, actually, I've never taken and I'm perfectly fine. So there was always this insinuation that if you're suffering, you could do something to manage it, go and do more yoga and go and do more exercise. And that is something that you could do. And I think there is a lot of ignorance around the notion of menopause, of course, and stigma associated with the loss of fertility, loss of virility, loss of fecundity. And so we internalize this shame around that as well. I think that happens a lot. And the more we talk about it, I suppose the more we share these stories, the more we share that it isn't just after 50 years old. It isn't just after a certain age. There are lots of people who face early menopause as well. There are lots of different kind of symptoms as well. And more workplaces are taking this on board now as well about in the regulations. I recently saw Harvard University is creating some more universities and academies, I hope, will take that on board as well. So yes, I think it's about giving women the information, all the information, so that they are able to make a decision, because we often think that we are free to make a decision, but we don't even have the right information to be able to make a decision. There's another question about, yes, we've been taught, and I think this is really interesting from Erin, and this is really interesting because in my book, especially, I'm talking about the notion of woman and womanhood and how trans women or trans men are treated, and because of their status, how they might be stigmatized even further. So the intersectionalities of these identities have to be considered. So Erin asked, how do transgender people fit into conversations like these, especially when it comes to inequalities in medicine? And I wondered, Martin, if you had any thoughts on how has been done in where you have been and what more can be done?
Well, I think a lot more can be done. I was actually very much involved with trans people in France when I was a physician, and I myself have a transgender daughter. So this is something that is central to the respect that we owe as physicians, as healthcare providers, to whatever choice a person makes with their own body. Exactly like Marie-Hélène said, if a woman wants to have a C-section, or if she wants to have a natural birth, or if she wants to have a natural birth at home, who are we to decide that she shouldn't? I have the feeling that whenever someone makes a decision on someone else's body, he or they suggest that this person's body doesn't belong to that person. And in a way, it feels like we should be slaves, every one of us, to whatever image the society, or in this case, healthcare providers, have of the way we should behave or the way we should be even. So as far as transgender people are concerned, I think there's a lot of ignorance. There is much lack of information about what it is to be a transgender person. And obviously, the persons who are best knowledgeable about what it is to be a transgender person are those persons. They should be the ones to give the information. And actually, that's what they do. I mean, when a person feels that he or she is transgender, the only kind of person that she can go to have information is other transgender people. And this should be generalized. This should be a part of healthcare providers' information. They should have teachers who are transgender people and who are going to tell them what it is to be and how they should behave, how they should respect whoever is in front of them and however they see them as a person. So I think beyond everything that's technical, and there are no two transgender persons who are identical. A person that identifies herself or themselves as transgender has a very specific and unique way of defining how they are transgender and what they want to do about that. And this, again, is a matter of respect. It's a matter of going out from the stereotypes of what is a man, what is a woman, and is there anything in the between. It's a matter of who am I and how do I define myself and how you should respect me for who I am. So there's a lot to do in educating healthcare providers as far as this is concerned, because again, patriarchy is still strong, stereotypes are still strong in medical schools and among physicians.
Ellen, please.
It's a really important question. And I think the issue of transgender is really, really vital. But we can situate that more broadly in terms of the way that healthcare systems and medical professions, and not just doctors, but more widely function, which is primarily been and still is, although it's beginning to change, from the vantage of a very gender binary approach. And this becomes especially significant when you're thinking about the relationship between gender and sexuality, transgender, gender non-binary identification. But it's also a problem in relation to thinking about men as one group and women as another group. And all kinds of assumptions are built into that in terms of particular expectations of how men and women express symptoms, the kind of health problems that they get. So heart disease would be a good one, the kind of assumption that men get these kind of symptoms, women get those kind of symptoms in the context of having a heart attack and so on and so forth, just one example. So I think we need to, or it's really critical for us generally, but within health professions and healthcare delivery broadly, to really think about how we are approaching people through the lens of gender, and not to make assumptions about categories of people, and being very cognizant of kind of stereotypes and expecting this class of person, like a trans woman or a straight gender binary identifying woman behaves that way. I think that can lead to problems of misdiagnosis of symptoms and inappropriate treatment. So I think medical professions more generally need to have much more enriched training about what gender is and what it means to people in relation to their health.
Thank you so much, both. I think that's, really something we have to ponder, especially as this discourse around the notion of woman and womanhood is becoming so polarized at the moment, and the nuances are being lost. And something I wanted to look at in my own work and in my book about how transgender, the biases the transgender community face, and especially trans women, but also trans men. And I spoke to quite a few, but in the end, I didn't include them in the book because I didn't want it to be tokenistic, because as Martin said, not one trans person is not the same as another. So even if I talk to 20, I cannot homogenize their experience and say, this is what we should do, or this is how they feel. And also, I think there is a lack of data. There's a paucity of data still, which means that actually why we are not including their stories or their narratives, we are not centering them in this discourse. So even if this discourse carries on, trans community is not part of this discourse. Their stories are not being heard or shared that much. So I think it's really important that we talk more, we center more, we share their stories more broadly. More data is collected about the biases, the prejudices, the discrimination they face, about the lack of medical diagnosis and treatment, gender dysphoria that they go through several cases as well. I think we need to do that, and we need to broaden these notions of gender. As Ellen talked about, that we are so stuck in gender binaries, which also means that we are going back and stuck in feminine and masculine stereotypes about what men are, what women are, and how they should be. And I think some of my concerns around some of the debates or discussion around how we need to have more female bodies in medical tests is also that I worry that we are kind of going back to this idea of biological essentialism, that there is something inherently different between men and women, that we need to there is need to bring in women discourses and debates, but still at the same time, we cannot go back to those outdated ideas and tropes that there is something inherently different biologically different between men and women, because that's where these notions of stereotypes start from as well. I think I'll move on to some other questions, which lots of questions here. Somebody is talking about how there are other stereotypes imposed on women in terms of their appearance, being always looking young, thin, sexually appealing. And this is conveyed by the media, social network, So especially for teenagers, it's very difficult to take control of their bodies and not to feel pressure that you have to fit a norm in some way. I wonder who would like to, is anybody interested in taking this question about how we can move away from these kind of idealized norms of what women's bodies should look like? Ellen, did you have any thoughts?
No, it's a good point. It's a really difficult issue, and I'm aware, as someone who's teaching young people sociology and sociology of health and illness, sociology of gender, just how interested students are in this issue and the significant impact that they feel this has on them, young men as well as young women, but particularly young women, and a concern that has been documented and demonstrated in research of the association between unrealistic body images projected in selfies and so on and so forth have on mental health and well-being of women. Of course, this expresses itself in different ways in different cultures, in different parts of the world, but it's really a powerful force, I think, and quite detrimental in many ways to women's well-being. Of course, there are protests or counter trends, no, trends the wrong word, but counter movements or people who are trying to go against this, such as fat positive and body positive movements, for example, that may begin to have some inroads into this. But it seems to me that it's a really powerful cultural force that is likely to be with us for some time, and it's difficult to negotiate for young people in particular.
Elinor, did you have any thoughts on this? Perhaps.
Yeah, I agree with Alan. It feels like such an immutable and difficult and, hugely complex issue. And it also feeds into, this perpetuation of these image ideals also have an impact in medicine too. I mean, the Girl Who Cried Pain study, which was conducted in 2001, that looked at data gathered on the treatment of women, especially with chronic pain, looked at data since the 70s. It looked at how these, gender stereotypes around femininity, so not just in terms of how women and girls express pain, the kind of language they use, but also how they speak and how they look, did have a demonstrable impact on how they were treated. So, prettiness was a currency in terms of, how legitimate or not legitimate pain was perceived to be. So we see this reflected, so much, it's so deeply ingrained in the way that our younger people, girls and boys, are sort of situating themselves in the world through imagery, but it has a really, but it ricochets in a really damaging way into our other systems upon which we depend for our health and well-being. I mean, the myths around, larger bodies, around fat bodies, for example, impacting how healthcare can even be accessed before that question of weight, and those damaging myths around weight taken out of the equation. So yeah, it's a huge problem, but something that I agree with Ellen. I hope that now with, more conscious communities around chronic illness, around bodies, around gender identity, we can hope for change. But yeah, it is a really difficult and complex issue.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you both. I think there is, again, we come back to this notion of the ideal in society, and how through history, these idealized norms have been created. It's very Western centric as well in a lot of ways. It's very, there is a notion of white, slender bodies which become the norm, and so anything that deviates from it. And we know lots of research studies which show that this link between the body mass index, the bands that are created are actually not determined. They are not ideal. There are lots of flaws in these bands or these determinants that are created. But also, as you said, there is a sense of halo bias. So if somebody is considered closer to the center, the idealized norm, then a halo is created, which means that can spill over into other domains where they would be treated more favorably, while a horn bias is when somebody's at the fringes, their multiple identities mean that they are more not as close to the center, to the idealized norm. They are more likely to be stigmatized and discriminated. And I discussed that in Sway in my first book. And so all these things have multiple implications. And that's why I think the notion of intersectionality of identities, I think, is really important as well, because we are not just one identity, and our multiple identities and our status in society where we are in this hierarchy affects how we are treated by medical professionals and how we are treated by other people. And then it creates a perception self loop where we internalize these perceptions of how other people perceive us as well. Marie-Hélène, I wanted to ask you, there's a question here about how, especially in the UK, there are organizations that equip women with knowledge and confidence so that they can question medical advice and decision-making during childbirth, like the National Childbirth Trust, which I have no personal experience of, so I cannot say reliably how good that is or not. But the question is, this is a paid-for service, and many cannot afford to access this. So is there a correlation between affluence and birth outcomes, do you think? In your work in the countries that you're looked at, is there in terms of privilege or affluence or socioeconomic status and birth outcome? Have you seen that?
Do you mean, I'm not sure to understand the question, sorry.
In terms of who can afford some of the services, or who are richer or more well off, do they have better health outcomes or birth outcomes?
Better health outcomes, maybe, yes, but we see in France that I work a lot about obstetric violence, but what I see is that when you are rich, you can also suffer from obstetric violence. So this is not a question of rich or not rich. There are very famous hospitals in Paris who can pay a lot to give birth there, but you are not treated better than in another place. So it's difficult to see. It's sure that when you are poor people, you don't eat so much, you don't have access to medical care. Of course, there is a problem about when you give birth, or when you have genital mutilation. But what I see, I think almost all women suffer from gynecologic and obstetric violence, even if they are very rich.
Thank you. As we've talked about, I think there has to be a correlation in some way about our health outcomes and our status in society. So we know, for instance, in the US, women who are not as well off, and they're mostly women of color, but also women lower socioeconomic class, cannot access Medicaid and cannot access medical insurance. So they do not have access to abortion and contraceptives and all those things. In the UK, I talked about infertility and IVF treatments, and we know that it depends so much on where we are, because NHS is the postcode lottery about who gets free IVF treatments, but also who's able to take time off work, who's able to drive to these clinics. All those kind of things matter. So ultimately, the question of how much access we have to these services, even if they are free, or our outcomes in terms of maternity or childbirth or medical diagnosis and treatment, depends so much on our status and position in society. And also it creates that kind of sense that that some people have more knowledge, as you said, about this as well. Is anybody? Yes, Martin would like to say something.
Yeah, I would like to add. I agree with Marie-Hélène. All women in all from all backgrounds suffer from violence because they're women, and I can attest that in France, especially because I've heard and met with so many women from all backgrounds that were really misdiagnosed, mistreated, that were not believed when they said they were in pain, that were not listened to when they were asking for something they had a right to be given. But also, the status counts very much so. And you can hear when you are a woman who has a certain affluence, when you are a woman who can access the internet or who can access, you know, a social network, you can express yourself, express your anger, express your emotion, and tell your story. When you are a woman who doesn't have access to all that, there's not even an echo of what happens to you. I think there is a lot to be said about women who do not speak the language of the country where they live, and they don't have access, a good access to healthcare facilities, when they don't speak the language, when they are not. I was a physician in a countryside hospital, and we had many Rom women who traveled all over the country, and they had no specific physician to go to, but we would welcome them and give them all the contraceptives they needed. And they would come periodically to us because they had no other place to go to. So it was all based on our benevolence towards them. If they had no one to ask for, I don't know, the pill or an IUD, they couldn't get any. So there's a lot to be said about all those fringes of women who belong to the most undervalued parts of society, and they have even less ways of being listened to, and they are much more pain. So of course, the affluence counts, even though I think, like Marie-Hélène, that you may be a very rich woman and still be mistreated because you're a woman.
Thank you both. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, Marie-Hélène, that there are some universal experiences because of the notion of gender, of women, and the biases that exist, as we've talked about through the last hour or so in this session, but also our position in society affects it. The privileges we have affect how much we know and how much we are able to assert and demand for ourselves as well, and the rights that we think we have. So yes, of course, all those things matter as well. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and there's so much we could still talk about. We could talk about for another 4 hours, and there are lots of questions here, but hopefully in some way or the other, we have addressed most of the questions here. So all I have to do now is to thank you, all of you, for being part of this. Martin Winckler, Marie-Hélène Lahaye, Ellen Annandale, and Elinor Cleghorn. A reminder that the recording of the event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 20th of June. You will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you would like to purchase a copy of Elinor's book, Unwell Women, released last week, or my own book, Motherhood on the Choices of Being a Woman, which was released 2 weeks ago, with signed bookplate copies, can be found at a partner bookseller, independent bookshop, foxlanebooks.co.uk, and it's Independent Bookshop Week, so hope you can support them. A range of books by our other panelists, which are excellent, are also available elsewhere online too. We very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with York Festival of Ideas, and we'd love for you to continue the conversations using the hashtag #YorkIdeas. All that remains is for me to thank all of you for attending the event today, for your brilliant questions, for your engagement, and I hope you've enjoyed all of the fascinating discussions. Thank you so much.